The sky over Ålesund glowed in hues of amber and gold, a warm farewell from the sun as it dipped toward the horizon. The icy roads glistened, reflecting the soft light of the setting sun, casting a magical glow over the rugged landscape. Snow-capped mountains rose majestically around them, their jagged peaks piercing the sky like ancient sentinels. Emma glanced out the passenger window, her breath catching in her throat. It was hard not to get lost in the beauty of it all. The fjords, the snow-dusted forests, and the shimmering waters of the Atlantic. Yet, beneath the surface of this serene journey, a storm was brewing. Beside her, Eric's grip tightened on the steering wheel as they navigated the winding roads from Ålesund to Åndalsnes. His jaw clenched, not from the cold, but from something far more dangerous. They were running from something or someone, but for now, all they could do was drive. The radio played a soft tune, but it did little to calm the tension that simmered between them. "We shouldn't have come back. We should have stayed in Oslo," Emma whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the engine. Eric's eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, but his response came quickly. "We didn't have a choice. If we're going to find out what happened, we have to face it. We can't keep running." The tension in the car thickened as the road began to climb into the mountains. They were heading straight into the heart of the darkness they had tried so hard to escape. The fading sunlight only emphasized how isolated they were, the golden hues giving way to a creeping darkness that seemed to swallow the landscape whole. As the sun disappeared behind the peaks, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She turned her gaze to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, following them. But there was nothing, only the darkening road behind them. "We should stop for the night," she said, her voice trembling despite herself. Eric shook his head. "No, not yet. We need to get farther away." But Emma wasn't so sure. She felt the weight of something lurking in the distance, a shadow from their past that wouldn't let them go so easily. The road ahead was long, and the journey had only just begun. They pulled into a small lookout point, the view below breathtaking. A glistening fjord that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon, the water reflecting the fading golden sky. For a moment, everything was still, too still. "We need to talk about it, Eric. We can't keep pretending it didn't happen." He said nothing, but the silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. Something had happened on their last visit to Åndalsnes, something that neither of them had been able to forget. And now, the past was catching up with them. Emma stepped out into the cold air, her breath forming misty clouds in front of her as she walked toward the edge of the lookout. She closed her eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over her, trying to steady her racing heart. But when she opened them again, something, or someone, caught her eye. A shadow moved in the trees just beyond the clearing. Her breath hitched. "Eric, do you see that?" Eric was already out of the car, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the tree line. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the branches. But then, there it was again, a figure just on the edge of the trees watching them. "Get back in the car, Emma. Now." Without hesitation, Emma scrambled back into the car, her heart pounding in her chest. Eric threw the car into gear, the tires spinning on the icy road as they sped away from the lookout. But as they drove deeper into the mountains, the shadow in the trees seemed to follow them, always just out of sight, always there. The drive from Ålesund to Åndalsnes had turned into something far more than scenic. It had become a race against time, a race against the shadows of the past. The car sped along the winding mountain road, headlights cutting through the early winter darkness that had descended like a shroud. Emma's pulse thudded in her ears as she glanced behind them, half expecting to see the shadowy figure still following. The road was empty, save for the occasional snow-draped pine tree and the dark expanse of mountains looming over them. "Do you think they're still behind us?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale under the strain. "I don't know," he replied, his tone grim. "But we can't risk stopping until we're sure." Emma turned back to the window, her reflection ghostly against the night. The landscape had transformed in the fading light, What had been serene and beautiful under the golden hues of sunset now felt cold, menacing. The mountains, which once seemed like guardians of the fjords, now felt like they were closing in, hiding secrets of their own.
Silence settled in the car once again, save for the occasional hum of the engine and the crunch of snow under the tires. Emma couldn't help but think back to their last trip to Åndalsnes, how everything had started so innocently. A hiking adventure, just the two of them, exploring the breathtaking landscapes of Norway. But something had happened out there, something neither of them had spoken about since. And now it felt like the past had come alive, chasing them down these isolated roads. "Do you think this is because of what happened last time?" Emma asked, her voice tight. Eric didn't respond immediately. He was focused on the road ahead, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flickered with a dark memory he couldn't quite shake. "I don't know," he finally said. "But if it is, we need to be ready. We can't let it happen again." They drove in silence for what felt like hours, the road twisting and turning through the mountains. Occasionally, the headlights would illuminate something, a flash of movement in the trees, a shadow darting across the road. But it was always gone too quickly to confirm if it was real or just their imaginations playing tricks in the darkness. As they neared a bend in the road, Eric slowed the car. Ahead, a small gas station appeared, its neon sign flickering against the inky black sky. "We should stop," Eric said, his voice low. "We need fuel, and we need to regroup." Emma nodded, though a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. The station looked abandoned, its windows fogged with condensation, and the only light came from a single dim bulb that flickered at the entrance. They pulled in, and as the engine died, an eerie stillness enveloped them. Eric stepped out first, glancing around before motioning for Emma to follow. The cold air bit at her skin as she exited the car, the sound of her boots crunching in the snow the only thing breaking the silence. "I'll fill up the tank," Eric said, keeping his eyes on the road behind them. "Stay close." Emma nodded, but something pulled her attention toward the station itself. The door was slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. Curiosity gnawed at her, and despite her better judgment, she found herself drifting toward it. As she reached for the door handle, she hesitated, the memory of the shadowy figure in the trees flashing in her mind. "Emma?" Eric's voice called out, snapping her back to reality. She turned to see him watching her, concern etched on his face. "I'm just going to check inside," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Something about the station felt wrong. But before she could take another step, the door creaked open wider, revealing nothing but darkness inside. A gust of wind blew through the mountains, carrying with it the faint sound of something, a whisper, barely audible but unmistakably there. Emma froze, her heart racing. She wasn't sure if it was the wind or something else entirely. Eric dropped the fuel nozzle with a clang, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward Emma. "Emma, wait. Don't go in there," he said, his voice sharp. But something about the station had already drawn her in, like a whisper she couldn't quite hear but felt compelled to follow. The cold bit into her skin as she stood frozen at the door, torn between stepping into the unknown and retreating back to the safety of the car. "Emma?" Eric's voice snapped her out of her trance. She blinked, her hand hovering just above the worn door handle. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered as he moved closer to her, glancing warily at the darkened interior. "I don't know. I just thought maybe we could find something inside," Emma replied, her voice uncertain. "Supplies or information?" "We don't need anything from in there," Eric said firmly, his breath misting in the cold air. "We need to keep moving. We're too exposed here." But before they could turn back, the door creaked open further as if welcoming them. A draft of cold air rolled out from the dark, carrying with it the faint scent of damp wood and gasoline. Inside, a single flickering light struggled to stay on, casting eerie shadows across the shelves lined with dust-covered products. Emma couldn't explain it, but something in her gut told her there was something they needed to find inside. Maybe it was just the paranoia of being chased, or maybe it was instinct. Either way, her feet moved forward before her mind could fully catch up. "Emma." Eric sighed but followed her inside. His eyes scanned the small shop, every creak of the old wooden floor setting him on edge. "We shouldn't stay here. Let's just get back to the car." But Emma had already moved deeper into the station, her fingers brushing against the countertops. There was a small newspaper stand near the register, old headlines from months ago, maybe even a year. She flipped through them absently, her mind racing with the memory of that figure in the woods. Could they have followed them this far? Could they still be out there, watching? She froze, her eyes catching on one headline, bold and unmistakable. "Disappearance in Åndalsnes still unsolved." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She remembered the case. Everyone in the region did. A young couple had vanished last winter while hiking near the Fjords. No bodies were ever found, and no clues left behind, only their abandoned car. The case had haunted her thoughts since she and Eric had first visited this place. They had been hiking the same trails. It could have been them. "Eric," she called, her voice shaky as she picked up the paper. "Look at this." Eric moved beside her, his brow furrowing as he read the headline. "Yeah, I remember that," he muttered, glancing out the window into the encroaching darkness. "What does it have to do with us?" Emma shook her head, the knot in her stomach tightening. "I don't know, but something about it feels connected. What if whoever, or whatever, was following us back there had something to do with this? What if it's not just a coincidence?" Eric ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his voice. "Emma, this is a small town. People disappear sometimes, especially in places like this. It doesn't mean we're in the middle of some conspiracy." Emma's eyes didn't leave the paper. "But what if it does?" she whispered, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. "What if we're being pulled into something bigger than we understand?" Before Eric could respond, the sound of a distant engine cut through the silence. Both of them froze. The sound grew louder, drawing closer to the gas station. "Someone's coming," Eric said, his voice low, immediately on alert. "We need to get out of here now." They moved quickly, leaving the paper behind as they darted toward the exit. But just as they reached the door, the headlights of an approaching vehicle illuminated the front of the gas station, casting long shadows against the frosted glass. Eric cursed under his breath and pulled Emma back into the darkened corner of the store. "Stay low," he whispered. "Let's see who it is." The car, a black SUV, pulled up slowly, its headlights sweeping across the snow-covered parking lot before turning off. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the wind outside. Then, the driver's door opened. A figure stepped out, silhouetted against the headlights, their movements deliberate and unnerving. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she and Eric watched from the shadows, barely daring to breathe. The figure moved toward the gas station door, their footsteps crunching in the snow. Emma's mind raced. Were they friendly, or were they connected to whoever had been following them? She didn't want to wait to find out. As the figure reached for the door, Eric grabbed Emma's hand. "Back door," he whispered urgently. They didn't have time to waste. Without a second glance, they crept silently toward the rear of the station, the echo of the door creaking open behind them, sending a fresh wave of fear through Emma's body. Whoever this person was, they were inside now, and they were getting closer. Emma and Eric moved quickly, their footsteps light and careful as they slipped through the back of the gas station. The door creaked slightly as they pushed it open, the cold night air rushing in to meet them. Outside, the world felt eerily still, as if holding its breath. The snow-covered ground stretched out like a pale blanket beneath the dark sky, the distant mountains casting long, shadowy fingers over the landscape. They could hear the faint sounds of movement inside the station now, the stranger walking slowly, methodically. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry, and that only made Emma more anxious. Her pulse raced as she crouched low, following Eric around the corner of the building. He paused briefly, looking back toward the front of the station where the black SUV sat, its engine still warm, sending faint curls of steam into the frosty air. "We need to get to the car," Eric whispered, his breath visible in the cold. "If we can just make it to the car, we can get out of here before they realize we're gone." Emma nodded, her body tense with fear. She glanced around, scanning the area for any sign of another vehicle or person, but the road remained deserted. The only sound was the crunch of their boots in the snow and the distant hum of the wind as it moved through the mountains. They were just a few meters from their own car now, the old station wagon sitting silently where they had parked it moments ago. Emma's heart leapt in her chest. If they could just reach it, they would be safe, or at least safer than they were now. But just as Eric reached for the door handle, the sound of the gas station's front door opening echoed through the still night. The stranger had come back outside. "Get in," Eric hissed, pulling the door open as quietly as he could. Emma slipped into the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her seatbelt. Eric slid into the driver's seat, quickly turning the key in the ignition. For a tense moment, the engine sputtered, struggling to come to life in the cold. Emma's eyes darted toward the gas station. The figure had stepped out into the parking lot, their face hidden beneath the shadow of a hood. They stood still, scanning the area as if searching for something or someone. Emma held her breath, willing the engine to start, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest she was sure it could be heard outside. Finally, the car roared to life, the headlights flaring on and slicing through the darkness. The figure's head snapped toward them, and for a brief second, Emma thought she saw something. Recognition. Maybe? In the way they moved. But there was no time to dwell on it. "Go!" Emma urged, her voice trembling with urgency. Eric didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires spinning briefly on the icy ground before finding traction. The car shot forward, throwing up a spray of snow behind them as they sped out of the parking lot and back onto the road. The black SUV's headlights flared to life behind them. "They're following us," Emma said, her voice shaky as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The dark vehicle loomed large behind them, its speed increasing as it gained ground. "I know," Eric replied through gritted teeth, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "I'm going as fast as I can." The road twisted and turned as it wound through the mountains, the snow making the drive even more dangerous. Eric navigated each curve with precision, but the SUV behind them wasn't backing off. Emma could feel the tension in the air thickening with each passing second, the sense of being hunted closing in around them. "What do they want?" Emma asked, more to herself than to Eric. "Why are they following us?" "I don't know," Eric muttered, glancing at the mirror again. "But we need to lose them." He pushed the car faster, the trees and mountains blurring past them as the station wagon skidded slightly on the snow-packed road. Emma's heart was in her throat, the fear of crashing mixing with the terror of what might happen if they were caught. She looked over at Eric, his face set with determination, and felt a flicker of hope. If anyone could get them out of this, it was him. But then, as they rounded a sharp bend in the road, the SUV swerved violently behind them, sliding sideways across the ice. For a brief moment, Emma thought they might have lost them, but the SUV recovered quickly, speeding up again, now closer than ever. "They're not giving up," Emma whispered, panic creeping into her voice. Eric's jaw clenched. "Then neither will we." Ahead, the road opened up, and in the distance, the faint lights of a small cabin came into view, barely visible through the thickening snowfall. It was remote, perched on the edge of the forest, a lone refuge in the middle of nowhere. Eric's eyes narrowed as he saw it, a plan forming in his mind. "Hold on," he said, his voice tense. "I've got an idea." Emma didn't ask what. She trusted him. She had to. As the cabin grew closer, Eric veered off the road, the car bouncing over the uneven snow-covered ground. The SUV behind them followed suit, but Eric had anticipated that. He hit the brakes suddenly, the station wagon skidding to a stop behind a cluster of trees. The SUV, not expecting the maneuver, shot past them, speeding toward the cabin. "Now," Eric whispered, throwing the car into reverse. Emma clutched the seat as they backed out of sight, disappearing into the dense forest. The road ahead was barely visible as Eric navigated the car deeper into the dense forest. Snow began to fall again, soft and steady, coating the windshield in a thin layer of frost that made it difficult to see. The headlights cast long, ghostly beams through the trees, but the path was narrow, winding, and treacherous. Emma sat in silence beside him, her thoughts racing. The sense of danger was still thick in the air, clinging to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the dark figure from the SUV emerge from the trees behind them. Every snap of a branch or rustle of the wind made her flinch, her nerves frayed by the tension that hung between them. "Where are we going?" Emma finally asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "We can't just keep driving into the forest. What if we get stuck, or worse, lost?" Eric's jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I'm trying to get us as far away from that cabin as possible. We need to put distance between us and them, whoever they are." "But where does this road lead?" Emma pressed, her hands gripping the seat tightly. "Is there anywhere safe out here?" Eric hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowing as he considered their options. "I don't know for sure, but I remember seeing a sign for an old logging camp when we passed through here earlier. It's remote, probably abandoned, but it might give us some cover until we figure out what to do next." Emma bit her lip, doubt gnawing at her. The idea of hiding out in an abandoned camp in the middle of the wilderness wasn't exactly comforting, but at this point, they had few choices. Whoever was following them had resources, a vehicle, knowledge of the area, and they had already proven they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Whatever that was. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. Snow swirled around them in thick, heavy gusts, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Eric slowed the car, squinting through the windshield as he tried to stay on the narrow path. Suddenly, the car lurched violently to the side, skidding on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. Emma let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to the dashboard for support as the tires spun helplessly for a moment before regaining traction. "Careful!" she exclaimed, her heart racing. "We can't afford to get stuck out here." "I know," Eric muttered through gritted teeth, wrestling with the steering wheel to keep the car steady. "The snow's getting worse. We need to find that camp soon, or we're going to be in real trouble." For several long, agonizing minutes, they drove in silence, the snow falling thicker with each passing moment. Emma's mind raced, replaying the events of the night over and over, trying to piece together a logical explanation for why they were being chased. But nothing made sense. Why had the stranger at the gas station been waiting for them? And what was in Åndalsnes that had suddenly made them targets? Just when the tension in the car seemed unbearable, a flicker of movement appeared in the distance, an old wooden sign, barely visible through the snow. "There," Eric said, pointing. "That's it." He turned the car down a narrow, snow-covered track, the tires crunching loudly beneath them as they approached the sign. It was weathered and worn, the words "Skogen Logging Camp" barely legible beneath layers of chipped paint and frost. The camp itself came into view a moment later, a small cluster of dilapidated buildings huddled together at the edge of the forest. The cabins looked abandoned, their roofs sagging under the weight of snow, their windows dark and lifeless. The place had been deserted for years, judging by the overgrown paths and the general state of decay. Eric pulled the car to a stop outside one of the larger cabins, cutting the engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. Emma felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach as she stared at the dark, empty structures around them. "This doesn't feel right," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. "What if they find us here?" Eric turned to her, his expression serious but determined. "We don't have a choice. We can't keep driving in this weather, and if we stay on the road, they'll catch up to us. This is our best shot for now." Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing with 1,000 worries. She knew he was right, but the thought of being trapped out here in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but snow and shadows, made her heart pound with fear. "Okay," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But we need to be careful." They stepped out of the car into the biting cold, the wind immediately cutting through their coats as they made their way toward the nearest cabin. The snow was knee-deep in some places, making each step a struggle. Eric led the way, pushing open the creaky door of the cabin with a grunt of effort. Inside it was cold and dark, the air stale from years of neglect. The room was small, with a few broken chairs scattered around an old fireplace that hadn't been used in ages. Dust coated every surface, and the windows were covered in a thin layer of frost, making it impossible to see outside. "We'll stay here for now," Eric said, his breath visible in the frigid air. "At least until the snow lets up." Emma nodded, though her nerves were still on edge. She glanced toward the window, her eyes scanning the dark forest beyond for any signs of movement. The thought of being found out here, alone and vulnerable, sent a shiver down her spine. As Eric began searching the cabin for anything useful, firewood, supplies, Emma sat down on one of the broken chairs, her mind still spinning. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? What had they stumbled into that had put them in this much danger? And most of all, who was out there in the shadows still hunting them?
The cold crept into Emma's bones as she sat in the cabin, her thoughts spiraling with anxiety. The howling wind outside was relentless, an eerie soundtrack to their precarious situation. Eric rummaged through the debris of the abandoned cabin, moving aside broken furniture and dust-covered remnants of a past life. Emma watched him, a mix of admiration and fear swelling in her chest. He was focused and determined, a stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed them just hours ago.
"Anything?" she asked, her voice breaking the heavy silence that enveloped them. Eric shook his head, frustration etched across his face. "Just some old logs and a few bits of garbage. Nothing we can use for warmth or shelter." He glanced at her, his eyes serious. "We need to figure out what our next move is. Sitting here won't solve anything." Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The truth was, she felt completely lost. It wasn't just the snowstorm swirling outside or the darkness closing in around them. It was the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. What if the SUV had already found them? What if their pursuers were closer than they realized? She stood up and moved closer to Eric, hoping her presence would ground them both. "Maybe we should try to find a better place to hide. This cabin feels too exposed." "I get that," Eric replied, rubbing his temples in frustration. "But right now, if we venture out into the storm, we risk losing our way. It's already hard to see anything out there. And besides, they might be looking for us. We can't give them any more chances to find us." "Then what do we do?" Emma asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We can't just wait here forever." Eric took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Let's take a look around. If there's anything we can use for shelter or warmth, we need to find it. And if we're lucky, maybe there's a way to barricade the door." Emma followed Eric as he moved from room to room, peering into dusty corners and searching through abandoned cabinets. The cabin had clearly been neglected for years. A feeling of desolation hung in the air, like a ghost of what once was. She could only imagine the families that had spent summers here, laughing and enjoying the beauty of the surrounding wilderness. Now, it was just a shell, a remnant of better days. They finally made their way to a back room that seemed to be in slightly better shape than the others. There was a small window at the far end, and though it was covered in frost, Emma could make out the dark shapes of trees swaying in the wind. It was a reminder of how isolated they were. Eric pulled open a closet door, revealing a few old blankets and some tattered curtains. "This might help keep the cold out," he said, pulling out the blankets and shaking off the dust. Emma took the blankets from him and started draping them over the broken furniture, trying to create a makeshift barrier against the cold. The fabric was thin and worn, but it would help block out some of the chill. As she worked, Eric knelt down by the fireplace, inspecting the remnants of wood and ash. "Hey," he said, his tone shifting as he dug through the debris. "Look at this." He held up a small box, its surface marred by age and neglect. "It might be a fire starter." Emma hurried over to him, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" He opened the box, revealing a handful of old matches nestled inside. "They're probably a little damp, but if we can find some dry wood, we might be able to get a fire going." "Do you think it's safe to light a fire?" Emma asked, glancing nervously toward the door. The thought of drawing attention to their hiding place sent a chill down her spine. "We need the warmth," Eric said, his voice firm but laced with concern. "If they find us, we'll be better off trying to defend ourselves in a well-lit space. But first, we need to find wood. Let's check outside. We'll be quick." Emma hesitated. The idea of stepping outside into the swirling snow and darkness made her heart race with fear. But she trusted Eric. He wouldn't put them in danger without a plan. "Okay," she said finally, steeling herself. "Let's do this." Eric led the way as they crept back out into the biting cold, the wind whipping around them like a living thing. The snow was deep, the crunch beneath their feet loud in the stillness. Emma felt exposed, like a target in the vast emptiness of the forest. She kept her eyes peeled for any signs of movement, her pulse quickening with every gust of wind that rattled the trees. They moved cautiously around the cabin, searching for any fallen branches or debris that might be dry enough to burn. The darkness was thick, swallowing everything in its grasp, and Emma's mind raced with thoughts of the black SUV and its driver, still out there somewhere. There! Eric suddenly pointed to a cluster of trees that seemed to have a few branches lying on the ground. "Let's check over there." Emma nodded, her heart pounding as they hurried toward the trees. The wind howled louder now, and she felt a sense of urgency pushing them forward. The moment they reached the branches, Eric began gathering them, his movements swift and purposeful. "Help me with this one," he said, gesturing to a larger branch half buried in the snow. Emma bent down, gripping the cold wood and pulling with all her strength. As they worked together, the atmosphere shifted slightly, as if they were no longer just running from danger but also fighting to reclaim some control over their situation. "Got it!" Eric exclaimed as they finally dislodged the branch from its icy prison. They quickly gathered as much wood as they could carry, cramming it under their arms and shivering in the cold. As they turned to head back to the cabin, Emma glanced over her shoulder, a feeling of dread creeping back in. The darkness felt oppressive, as if it were closing in on them. "Hurry," she urged, her voice strained with anxiety. They rushed back toward the cabin, the weight of the wood slowing them down, but the adrenaline pushed them forward. Once inside, they wasted no time setting up a small pile of kindling in the fireplace, the old matches clutched tightly in Eric's hand. "Here goes nothing," he murmured, striking one of the matches against the rough surface of the box. It ignited with a hiss, flickering to life. He quickly transferred the flame to the kindling, holding his breath as he watched for a reaction. The dry wood caught almost instantly, crackling and popping as it consumed the kindling. Emma sighed with relief as the fire blossomed, filling the small room with a warm glow. The flames danced merrily, casting flickering shadows on the walls and chasing away the chill that had settled into her bones. "See?" Eric said, his voice lighter now. "We're going to be okay." Emma smiled weakly, her heart still racing. But as she watched the fire burn brightly, she felt a flicker of hope. They had found a temporary refuge, a moment of safety amidst the chaos. "We need to keep watch," Eric said, his tone shifting back to seriousness. "I'll take the first shift. You try to rest." "I can't sleep," Emma protested, but Eric shook his head. "Please, you need to conserve your energy. I'll wake you if anything happens. Just trust me." Emma nodded reluctantly, settling down in a corner of the cabin where the warmth from the fire reached her. As she wrapped her arms around her knees, she felt her eyelids growing heavy, the exhaustion from the night's events finally catching up with her. She watched the flames dance for a few moments longer before allowing herself to close her eyes, the soft crackling of the fire lulling her into a fragile sense of safety. But even as sleep began to take her, a nagging worry remained. What if they weren't safe here? What if the danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Emma pushed the thoughts away, forcing herself to focus on the warmth of the fire and the steady breathing of Eric as he sat watch, vigilant and strong. Just as she began to drift off, a sharp noise shattered the stillness, a loud crash from outside that sent adrenaline racing through her veins. Emma's eyes shot open, her heart pounding as she scrambled to her feet. Eric was already alert, his eyes wide, scanning the darkness. "What was that?" Emma whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "I don't know," Eric replied, his expression tense. "But we need to find out." Emma's pulse quickened as they moved cautiously toward the door. The snow continued to fall, muffling sounds from outside, but the unease in the air was palpable. They were not alone anymore, and whatever danger they had tried to outrun was now closing in. Eric opened the door slowly, the cold air rushing in as they stepped outside, the light from the cabin spilling onto the snow-covered ground. Emma strained her eyes, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. The trees loomed ominously, their branches heavy with snow, but everything appeared still, too still. Then, a shadow darted past the edge of the forest. Emma's heart raced and she felt a rush of panic. "Did you see that?" she gasped, grabbing Eric's arm. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and steady. "Stay close." They moved cautiously toward the edge of the clearing, straining to see through the swirling snow. The branches crackled under their feet as they ventured farther from the warmth of the cabin, adrenaline surging through their veins. "Hello?" Eric called out, his voice echoing in the cold air. There was no response, just the sound of the wind whipping through the trees. Emma's instincts screamed at her to turn back, to seek refuge inside. But curiosity propelled her forward. What if it was just an animal? Or something more sinister? Her breath came in quick bursts, the cold air stinging her lungs as she pressed forward alongside Eric. Suddenly, another loud crash erupted nearby, and they froze in place. It was closer this time, a sound that made Emma's blood run cold. "We need to go back," she whispered urgently, her heart racing. "We shouldn't be out here." But before Eric could respond, another figure stepped into the clearing, dark and menacing against the backdrop of the falling snow. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the silhouette. "Run!" Eric shouted, grabbing Emma's hand and pulling her back toward the cabin as the figure emerged fully from the shadows. It was the stranger from the SUV, his face obscured by the falling snow, but the glint of metal in his hand was unmistakable. Emma's heart raced as they sprinted back toward the safety of the cabin, fear driving them forward. The figure followed close behind, his footsteps crunching in the snow, the sound echoing like a warning bell. Emma glanced back, dread pooling in her stomach as she saw the determination in his stride. They reached the cabin, Eric slamming the door behind them and locking it tightly. They leaned against it, breathless, their hearts pounding in their chests. "What do we do?" Emma gasped, panic rising in her throat. "Get the wood," Eric ordered, moving quickly to barricade the door with the branches they had gathered. The fire crackled behind them, its warmth a small comfort against the chill of fear. "Do you think he saw us?" Emma asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," Eric replied, working frantically to secure the door. "But we can't let him in here. We have to hold him off until we figure out a plan." Emma grabbed the remaining logs and started piling them against the door, her hands trembling as she fought to keep her composure. The sound of heavy footsteps thudded outside, growing closer, and she could feel her heart racing in her chest. "Stay quiet," Eric whispered, urgency in his tone. "If he can't hear us, he might think we've left." Emma nodded, her eyes darting to the windows as she held her breath. Outside, the wind howled, but beneath it, she could hear the figure moving, the crunch of snow underfoot sending chills down her spine. The seconds felt like hours as they huddled together in the dim light of the cabin, the fire flickering low. Emma could see the determination in Eric's eyes, the way his jaw clenched as he focused on the door, ready to defend their sanctuary. "Do you think he's just going to give up?" she whispered, a sense of dread creeping over her. "I don't know," Eric admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't panic. We have to think this through." A loud thud echoed against the cabin, rattling the walls and sending a jolt of fear through Emma. She glanced at Eric, her heart racing as she felt the tension building between them. "Eric," she said softly, "what if we don't make it out of here?" His gaze met hers, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. "We will," he said firmly, but she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "We have to stay strong, for each other." As the sound of footsteps continued outside, Emma could feel her resolve wavering. She knew they were in serious danger, and the walls of the cabin felt like they were closing in on her. But Eric's unwavering presence steadied her, a lifeline in the storm. They sat in silence, listening to the world outside, their breaths mingling in the cold air. Every creak of the cabin felt amplified, every gust of wind a reminder of how isolated they were. But in that moment of uncertainty, as they faced the darkness together, Emma felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. Whatever happened next, they would face it side by side. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension as Emma and Eric braced themselves for whatever came next. The fire crackled softly behind them, casting flickering shadows across the room, while outside, the relentless storm continued its assault.
Emma's heart raced as she tried to listen for any signs of the figure outside, the tension between her and Eric palpable.
"Do you think he's still out there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. The door creaked ominously as if in response, and she pressed her ear against the rough wood, straining to hear. "I don't know," Eric replied, his brow furrowed in concentration. "But we can't let our guard down. If he's determined, he might try to get in." Emma swallowed hard, fear pooling in her stomach. She could only imagine what the man was capable of, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. She thought of the moment when they had first spotted the SUV, the initial thrill of the scenic drive, now a distant memory overshadowed by danger. "We need to find something to defend ourselves," she said, glancing around the cabin for anything they could use as a weapon. "Just in case." Eric nodded, moving quickly to a dusty cupboard in the corner. He yanked it open and rummaged through the contents, tossing aside old dishes and useless items until he found a rusted iron poker. "This might do," he said, holding it up. Emma felt a small surge of relief at the sight of the makeshift weapon. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing," she said, taking it from him and gripping it tightly. They settled into a silent watch, the minutes stretching into an eternity. The wind howled outside, the sound both comforting and frightening, as they listened for any sign of movement. Emma felt a sense of dread wash over her, each second a reminder that they were not safe. Suddenly there was another loud thud against the door, followed by a sharp scraping sound. Emma's heart dropped, and she exchanged a panicked glance with Eric. "Get ready," he whispered, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The scraping continued, growing louder, as if something was trying to pry the door open. Emma's grip tightened around the poker, her knuckles turning white. The uncertainty was overwhelming, and she felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, a mixture of fear and desperation. "Eric," she said, her voice trembling, "what if he gets in?" "Then we fight," he said, his tone fierce and resolute. "We can't let him take us without a fight." Just then, the door rattled violently, a surge of force crashing against it. Emma flinched, her heart racing. They had to act quickly. "What do we do?" she urged, her voice rising in panic. "Stay behind me," Eric ordered, stepping in front of her. "I'll distract him. If he gets in, you swing the poker at him." Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, a mix of fear and determination. They were in this together, and she was ready to fight for her life. Another loud thud reverberated through the cabin, and the door splintered slightly. Emma's breath hitched in her throat, her mind racing with possibilities. This was it, the moment when they would have to confront their fear. With a final, powerful shove, the door burst open, snow swirling into the cabin like a dark omen. The figure stood silhouetted against the dim light, his face obscured by shadows, but the glint of a weapon unmistakable in his hand. Come out, wherever you are," he taunted, his voice low and menacing. Eric stepped forward, his stance defensive as he brandished the iron poker. "Get away from us," he shouted, his voice steady. The figure laughed, a cold, chilling sound that sent shivers down Emma's spine. "You think you can scare me with that old thing?" he sneered, stepping closer. "Stay back," Eric warned, brandishing the poker as if it were a sword, his eyes fierce. But the figure just smiled, a cruel twist of his lips. "You're outmatched, boy. You really think you can fight me?" Emma's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold, her grip tightening around the poker. Eric was brave, but they were at a disadvantage, and she could see the confidence in the stranger's eyes. "Let's see how tough you really are," the figure said, lunging forward with a swift movement. In that instant, everything slowed down. Emma reacted without thinking, swinging the poker with all her strength as Eric stepped to the side. The blow landed squarely against the figure's shoulder, causing him to stumble back with a grunt of surprise. "Now!" Eric shouted, and Emma felt a rush of adrenaline as they both pushed forward, ready to defend themselves against the intruder. The figure regained his balance, eyes narrowing with fury. "You're going to regret that," he hissed, lunging toward Eric with his weapon raised. Emma's heart pounded in her ears as Eric ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding a strike. They had caught him off guard, but she knew it was only a matter of time before he recovered. "Let's move," Eric shouted, and Emma followed his lead as they dodged to the side, desperately trying to stay out of the figure's reach. The cabin felt small and constricting as they fought to regain control, the shadows shifting as the fire flickered ominously. Emma swung the poker again, but the figure was quick, sidestepping her blow and countering with a swing of his own. The metal grazed Eric's arm, and he let out a sharp gasp. "Emma, watch out!" he shouted as he stumbled back, pain flashing across his face. Fueled by panic, Emma gritted her teeth and raised the poker again, her determination surging. "Get away from him!" she screamed, channeling all her fear into one powerful swing. The figure dodged, but not quickly enough. The poker connected with his arm, and he stumbled back, cursing under his breath. Emma took the opportunity to close the distance, her heart racing as she swung again. "Let's get out of here," Eric yelled, his voice strained with pain, and Emma nodded, desperate to escape the fight. They pushed toward the door, adrenaline coursing through their veins as they fought against the cold wind. But the figure wasn't finished yet. He lunged forward, grabbing Eric by the shoulder and yanking him back. "Don't think you can just run away," he growled, his grip tight. Emma felt a surge of fear as she turned to see Eric struggling against the man, his face twisted with effort. Without thinking, she swung the poker one last time, landing a solid hit against the figure's side. The man let go of Eric, stumbling back with a grunt of surprise. "You'll pay for that," he snarled, rage flickering in his eyes. "Now!" Eric shouted, and Emma seized the moment, grabbing his hand as they dashed out into the storm, the howling wind a fierce reminder of their precarious situation. They ran through the snow, breathless and terrified, adrenaline pushing them forward as they sprinted away from the cabin and the danger that lurked within. Emma's heart raced in her chest, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. But they had each other, and that gave her a sliver of hope in the bleakness of their reality. Together, they would find a way out of this nightmare.
The biting wind whipped against Emma and Eric as they raced through the snow, each step sending a spray of powder flying in their wake. The cabin faded behind them, swallowed by the swirling storm, but the shadow of danger loomed large in their minds. Emma could hear her heart pounding in her ears, the rhythm matching the crunch of snow under their feet.
"Where do we go?" she gasped, glancing back to see if the figure had followed them. The darkness of the woods surrounded them, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. The howling wind carried the scent of pine and something darker, a sense of foreboding that prickled at her skin. "Just keep moving," Eric urged, pulling her along as they veered into the shelter of the trees. "We need to find somewhere safe to hide." His breath came out in quick puffs, visible in the cold air, and Emma could see the determination etched on his face. Despite the fear, he radiated strength, a beacon in the storm. They pressed deeper into the forest, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Emma fought against the chill seeping into her bones, her mind racing with thoughts of the figure and what he might do if he caught up with them. The adrenaline that had propelled them forward was beginning to wane, and fatigue set in. She could feel her legs starting to ache, but she pushed it aside, focusing on Eric beside her. Suddenly, a low growl pierced the silence, reverberating through the trees. Emma froze, her heart leaping into her throat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, gripping Eric's arm tightly. "Yeah," Eric replied, his voice low and tense. "Stay close." He scanned their surroundings, his eyes wide with caution. A moment later, a dark shape burst from the underbrush, and Emma's breath caught in her throat as she prepared for the worst. But to her surprise, it was a large dog, its fur matted with snow, bounding toward them with a wagging tail. It came to a stop in front of them, panting heavily, eyes bright with excitement. "Whoa, hey there," Eric said, his voice tinged with relief. "Where did you come from?" Emma knelt down, cautiously extending her hand. "Are you lost, buddy?" she murmured, her fear momentarily forgotten as the dog sniffed her hand and then nudged her palm with its wet nose. The dog barked happily, and Emma couldn't help but smile. "Looks like we have a new friend," she said, her heart warming at the sight. But the moment of lightness was short-lived as they remembered their situation. Eric quickly looked around, his expression shifting back to concern. "We can't stay here. We don't know if that guy is still out there, and we definitely don't want to attract attention with barking." "Right," Emma agreed, pushing herself to her feet. "But maybe we can follow the dog? He might lead us somewhere safe." Eric nodded, and together they began to follow the dog, who bounded ahead through the snow, seemingly unfazed by the cold. The woods felt both welcoming and daunting, the trees providing a sense of shelter while also obscuring their path. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sky began to darken, the golden hues of the sunset replaced by shades of gray and deep blue. Snow continued to fall, thick and soft, muffling their footsteps and casting a serene blanket over the chaotic world outside. "What do you think that guy wanted?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice steady as they trudged through the snow. I mean, why attack us like that?" "I don't know," Eric replied, his jaw tightening as he considered her words. "But whatever it is, it can't be good. We have to be careful." The dog paused occasionally to look back at them, tail wagging, as if encouraging them to keep up. Emma couldn't help but chuckle at its enthusiasm, a stark contrast to the tension in her chest. After a few more minutes of following the dog, they stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated shed, half hidden by snow-laden trees. Emma's heart raced at the sight. "Do you think we should check it out?" Eric nodded, glancing at the dog, who was now sniffing around the entrance. "It might offer us some shelter, at least until we figure out what to do next." They approached the shed cautiously, the wind howling around them as if warning them to turn back. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking ominously as they pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and cold, the wooden walls lined with cobwebs, but it was dark and dry, a welcome reprieve from the biting wind outside. Emma peered into the shadows, her heart racing as she scanned the interior. "It looks like no one has been here in a while," she said, her voice echoing in the silence. Let's see if we can find anything useful," Eric suggested, moving further inside. The dog followed, tail wagging, as they rummaged through the shed. They found old tools, a few empty crates, and a couple of rusty cans that might have held food long ago. Emma felt a pang of disappointment, but Eric's voice broke through her thoughts. "Look," he said, pointing to a stack of old blankets piled in a corner. "These might help us stay warm." Emma rushed over, pulling the blankets free and shaking off the dust. They looked worn, but sturdy enough to provide some warmth. "This is great," she exclaimed, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Let's bundle up and then figure out our next move," Eric said, draping a blanket over his shoulders as he pulled another around Emma. They huddled close, the blankets wrapping them in a cocoon of warmth and safety, however temporary. As they settled into the shed, the reality of their situation began to sink in. "What if he finds us?" Emma whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "He won't," Eric replied firmly, though she could see the worry in his eyes. "We'll keep watch, and if he does come, we'll be ready." They exchanged a look, a silent promise passing between them. Despite the darkness outside, there was a flicker of hope within their makeshift refuge. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the wind howled and the snow fell, Emma found comfort in Eric's presence. The warmth of the blankets and the bond they had formed kept the encroaching dread at bay. They might be trapped in a nightmare, but together they would find a way through it. The shed creaked ominously as the wind whipped around it, but inside, Emma and Eric felt a fragile sense of safety. They huddled together under the blankets, the flickering shadows dancing along the wooden walls. Outside, the storm raged on, the sound of howling winds muffling the distant sounds of the world. "Do you think the dog will stay with us?" Emma asked, glancing at the furry companion who had settled at their feet, watching them with bright, curious eyes. "I hope so," Eric replied, scratching the dog behind the ears. "He seems loyal, And we could use a friend right now. The dog wagged its tail enthusiastically, and Emma smiled, feeling a warmth that cut through the lingering fear. The little creature seemed like a beacon of hope, a reminder that kindness still existed, even in the midst of chaos. "Maybe we should name him," she suggested, a glimmer of lightness creeping into her voice. Eric raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile forming on his lips. "What do you have in mind?" "Let's call him Storm," Emma said, glancing out at the swirling snow. "It fits him perfectly." "Storm it is," Eric agreed, nodding. "But we'll need to keep him safe too. If that guy comes back, we have to make sure he doesn't get hurt." Emma nodded, the reality of their situation crashing back down on her. "What do you think he wants with us?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't shake the feeling that this isn't just a random attack." "I don't know," Eric replied, his expression serious. "But whatever it is, we can't let our guard down. We have to be smart about this." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts, the crackling of the wind outside filling the space. Emma's mind raced with possibilities, but deep down she felt a connection with Eric that gave her strength. "Do you think we'll get out of this?" she finally asked, her voice soft. "We will," Eric said firmly, determination shining in his eyes. "We just have to stick together and stay one step ahead. We've gotten this far, and we can keep going." Emma felt a rush of gratitude for Eric's unwavering resolve. "I'm glad you're here with me," she admitted, her heart swelling with emotion. "Me too," he replied, a smile breaking through the tension. "We'll figure this out together." Just then, a loud crash echoed outside, making Emma jump. They exchanged alarmed glances, the atmosphere shifting from comfort to caution in an instant. "Stay quiet," Eric whispered, his voice low and urgent. He leaned closer, peering through a crack in the shed's wall to see what was happening outside. Emma held her breath, straining to hear over the roar of the wind. The sound of footsteps crunched in the snow, and her pulse quickened. "Do you think it's him?" she asked, fear creeping back into her voice. "It might be," Eric replied, his eyes narrowed as he watched the shadows outside. "But we can't be sure. We have to be ready for anything." Emma gripped the poker tightly, her knuckles white, as she prepared for whatever might come through that door. The dog, sensing the tension, stood alert, ears perked, and ready to protect his new friends. "Let's see if we can sneak a peek," Eric suggested, lowering his voice. "If we can get a good look at him, we might know what we're up against." They moved cautiously toward the door, each step filled with the weight of uncertainty. Emma could feel her heart racing as they approached, the darkness outside cloaked in the storm's fury. Eric gently pushed the door open, just enough to peek outside. The wind whipped against his face, snowflakes stinging like tiny needles, but he stayed steady, scanning the area. "What do you see?" Emma whispered, trying to keep her voice calm despite the panic rising within her. Eric's brow furrowed as he focused. "I can't see much, just shadows moving in the distance." Suddenly, the figure emerged from the swirling snow, silhouetted against the dim light of the storm. He looked larger than before, the shadow of menace unmistakable. "He's out there," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to move now." Emma's breath hitched in her throat as the reality of their situation washed over her. The man was hunting them, and they were cornered in a shed, isolated from the world. Eric took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Stay close. We need to find another way out." They crept back into the shadows of the shed, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick snow. The dog followed closely behind, sensing the danger and staying alert. "Is there a back door?" Emma asked, scanning the dimly lit interior for any escape route. "I don't think so," Eric replied, looking around frantically. "But we might be able to climb out through a window." Emma nodded, her mind racing. "We can't let him find us here." They quickly made their way to a small window on the far side of the shed, covered in frost. Eric pushed against it, testing the wood. "It's stuck," he muttered, frustration seeping into his voice. "Let me help," Emma said, placing her hands on the frame and pushing with all her might. The wood creaked and groaned, but slowly, it began to budge. With one final shove, the window flew open, letting in a gust of icy air. "Good job," Eric praised, and Emma felt a rush of adrenaline. "Let's get out," she urged, scrambling up onto the ledge. The dog jumped up beside her, barking excitedly, ready to follow. "Hold on," Eric said, glancing out into the storm before climbing up after them. "We have to be careful." They slipped through the window one by one, landing softly in the deep snow outside. The world was cloaked in a soft blanket of white, the storm swirling around them like a living entity. Emma looked around, her breath visible in the cold air. "Where do we go now?" she asked, scanning the trees for any signs of safety. Eric took a deep breath, his eyes focused. "We'll follow the trail the dog made. It should lead us away from the shed and hopefully to some shelter." With a firm grip on Emma's hand, they plunged into the snow, following the dog as it bounded ahead, tail wagging in the midst of the storm. The air was filled with the sound of the wind, but Emma could also hear her heart pounding in her ears. They moved quickly through the forest, navigating the thick underbrush, as they tried to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the shed. The dog led the way, its instincts guiding them through the darkness. "Stay close," Eric called, glancing back at Emma as the snow continued to fall, obscuring their path. Emma nodded, determination flooding her veins. They had made it this far together, and she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. With Eric by her side and Storm leading the way, she felt a surge of hope as they fought to survive the night and uncover the truth behind the danger stalking them through the woods.
Eric froze, his hand mid-reach toward one of the crates as Emma's words hung in the air. The cold silence of the underground chamber felt suddenly alive, thick with the weight of something unseen. Storm's growl grew deeper, more insistent, his body tense as his gaze remained fixed on the far corner of the room. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, the pulse of fear rushing through her veins.
She could barely breathe. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, a suffocating presence that seemed to come from all directions. Eric slowly straightened, his eyes following Storm's, but the beam of his flashlight couldn't reach far enough into the darkness to reveal what was lurking beyond. Still, the feeling was unmistakable. Something was there, just out of sight, waiting. "Stay close," Eric whispered, his voice low and tight. He pulled Emma closer to him, his hand gripping hers as if he could protect her from whatever was out there, though she wasn't sure how. They both stood still, listening, waiting for any sound, any movement that might give away what or who was in the room with them. But all they could hear was their own breathing and the faint crackle of the wind through the distant tunnels. It was maddening, the anticipation making Emma's skin crawl, her nerves on edge. Suddenly, there was a sound, a soft shuffling, like something moving slowly across the ground. Eric tensed, raising the flashlight higher, sweeping it back and forth across the chamber, but the light revealed nothing but decayed boxes and rusted metal. The noise came again, closer this time, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. Her grip tightened on Eric's hand, her breath catching in her throat as they both took a cautious step backward. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Eric muttered under his breath, his eyes never leaving the shadowed corner. "But we need to move. Now." Without another word, they turned and hurried back toward the tunnel entrance, Storm trotting ahead of them, his tail still stiff with unease. Eric kept the flashlight trained on the path in front of them, guiding their way as they moved quickly, their footsteps echoing against the damp, cold walls. Every instinct told Emma to run, to get as far away from that chamber as possible, but she forced herself to stay calm, to match Eric's steady pace. As they entered the narrow tunnel again, Emma risked a glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, emerging from the shadows behind them. But there was nothing, only darkness. They continued moving through the tunnel, deeper and deeper, their breaths loud in the confined space. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing heavier, more oppressive with each step. Emma's mind raced with questions, but none of them had answers. What had been in that chamber? Was it the same figure that had followed them through the woods, or was something else down here in the abandoned bunker? "We need to find a way out of here," Eric said, his voice strained. "There's got to be another exit somewhere. These tunnels can't go on forever." Emma nodded, though her anxiety was mounting with every passing second. They were moving forward, but they didn't know where this tunnel led, or if it would even lead them out of the underground maze. The thought of being trapped down here with whatever was lurking in the shadows made her stomach churn. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls damp and slick with moisture. The further they went, the colder the air became, and the oppressive darkness seemed to press in tighter, almost as if the walls themselves were watching. Emma's hand shook slightly as she held on to Eric, her fear growing with each step. Storm suddenly stopped in his tracks, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Eric shone the flashlight around the tunnel, looking for any sign of danger, but again, nothing was visible. Yet Emma could feel it. Something was off. "What is it, boy?" Eric asked, his voice soft as he knelt beside the dog. Storm whimpered, his ears flat against his head, and then Emma heard it, the faintest sound, barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. A distant noise, like footsteps echoing through the tunnels, coming from behind them. Her stomach dropped. "They're following us," she whispered, her voice shaking. Eric's face tightened, and without another word, he stood and began leading them forward at a faster pace, his flashlight sweeping urgently over the walls and floor ahead. Emma could feel her fear rising, her body tense as they quickened their steps, the sound of the distant footsteps growing louder, closer. Whoever or whatever was following them was catching up. "Run," Eric said suddenly, his voice sharp with urgency. Emma didn't need to be told twice. She broke into a sprint, her feet pounding against the wet floor as they raced through the tunnel, Storm darting ahead, his instincts kicking in. Eric kept the flashlight trained on the path, his breath coming in ragged bursts beside her. The sound of the footsteps behind them grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like whoever was chasing them was right on their heels. Emma's lungs burned, her heart racing in her chest as she pushed herself to go faster. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the exit nowhere in sight, but they couldn't stop. Not with the sound of their pursuer growing closer with each passing second. Suddenly, up ahead, the tunnel opened into a larger space. Eric grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her through the opening as they stumbled into what looked like another chamber. A larger one, with a high ceiling, and an old, rusted metal ladder leading up to a small hatch in the ceiling. "There!" Eric gasped, pointing to the ladder. "That might be the way out." Emma's heart leaped with hope, but the footsteps behind them were almost upon them. Without wasting a moment, Eric pushed her toward the ladder. "Go. Climb." Emma didn't hesitate. She grabbed the cold, slick rungs of the ladder and began to climb, her muscles screaming in protest from the exertion. Storm whined below, pacing anxiously as Eric stayed behind, his flashlight aimed toward the tunnel entrance, ready to face whatever was chasing them if it came through. As Emma reached the top of the ladder, she pushed against the hatch with all her strength. It creaked open, a rush of cold air hitting her face as she glimpsed the night sky above. Relief surged through her as she scrambled out, pulling herself onto solid ground. She turned, her breath visible in the freezing air, and reached down for Eric. He was halfway up the ladder now, Storm bounding up after him, when a shadow moved in the tunnel below. Emma's blood turned to ice as she saw a figure step into the chamber, its face hidden in the darkness.
Emma's heart raced as she stood at the edge of the open hatch, her breath clouding in the freezing night air. Her eyes were wide with terror as she watched the shadowy figure step into the chamber below. The faint light from Eric's flashlight flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows on the cold stone walls. For a split second, the figure stood still, just beyond the tunnel's entrance, its face obscured by darkness. But the menace in its posture was unmistakable.
"Eric, hurry!" Emma's voice trembled as she reached down, her hand stretched toward him. She could see the fear on Eric's face, but he was focused, climbing the ladder as quickly as he could. Storm had already scrambled up past him, the dog's instincts telling him that they needed to escape now. The figure moved closer, slow but deliberate, its footsteps echoing through the chamber. Eric was almost at the top, just a few rungs away, when Emma's worst fear materialized. The figure lunged forward, its movement swift and violent, reaching for the ladder with outstretched hands. Emma's scream caught in her throat as Eric reached the top. With one final burst of strength, he grabbed her hand, and she pulled him up with all the force she could muster. Together, they collapsed onto the cold ground outside, breathing hard, their bodies trembling from both the cold and fear. Without hesitation, Eric slammed the hatch shut, the heavy metallic thud reverberating through the ground. He twisted the rusted handle, locking it as tightly as possible, though they both knew it was only a temporary barrier. Whatever was down there, it wouldn't stop at that door. For a few heartbeats, there was silence. Only the howling wind surrounded them now, the biting cold of the night sinking into their bones. Emma pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her frantic breathing, while Eric knelt beside her, his hand on the hatch, as if ready to hold it closed if necessary. Storm barked once, his tail stiff, as if warning them that the danger wasn't over yet. Emma swallowed hard, her pulse still racing. What was that?" she gasped, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't know," Eric said, his voice tight with tension. "But it's not human, at least not anymore." Emma shuddered at his words, her mind racing back to the warnings they had heard. The tales about people who disappeared into these mountains and returned. Changed. Could this figure be one of them? The thought was too terrifying to dwell on, but there was no denying the unnatural way it had moved, the way it had followed them relentlessly through the storm, through the woods, through the tunnels. "We need to keep moving," Eric said, pushing himself up. His eyes scanned their surroundings, the dark landscape barely visible under the weak moonlight. They were out of the bunker, but now they were exposed, vulnerable in the open air with no idea where to go next. Emma nodded, though her legs felt weak beneath her. She struggled to her feet, her body aching from the cold and exhaustion. "Which way?" she asked, her voice cracking with the strain. Eric looked around, trying to get his bearings. The terrain was rugged, and the snow had piled up in thick drifts, making it hard to see any clear path. But ahead, beyond the jagged trees, the faint glow of distant lights shimmered on the horizon. "There," he said, pointing toward the lights. "That must be a village. We can make it if we hurry." Emma glanced toward the lights, hope flickering in her chest. Civilization, safety. If they could reach the village, they might finally be safe from whatever was pursuing them. But it was a long trek through the snow, and the cold was seeping deeper into their bones with every passing second. "Come on," Eric urged, his hand gripping hers tightly as they began to move. Storm trotted ahead, his ears perked up, leading the way as if he too sensed that salvation was close. They trudged through the snow, their footsteps muffled by the wind, their bodies aching with fatigue. The lights of the village seemed so far away, almost unreachable, but they kept moving, driven by the fear of what might be behind them. Every time Emma glanced over her shoulder, she half expected to see the shadowy figure emerging from the trees, its inhuman presence haunting them. The wind howled louder, biting at their exposed skin, but they pressed on. The ground was uneven, the snow deep in places, but Eric's grip on her hand was firm, steadying her as they navigated the difficult terrain. After what felt like hours, the lights grew brighter, the outlines of buildings becoming clearer through the falling snow. Relief surged through Emma's body, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of fear. What if the figure followed them all the way to the village? What if there was no escape, no matter where they ran? As they approached the outskirts of the village, Emma's legs gave out, her body collapsing into the snow. She gasped, her breath shallow, the exhaustion finally catching up to her. "Emma!" Eric knelt beside her, his face filled with concern. I'm okay," she panted, though she felt far from okay. Her muscles ached, her body trembling with cold and fear. Just need a minute." Eric pulled her up gently, his arm around her shoulders. "We're almost there, just a little farther." With Eric's help, she forced herself to stand, though every step felt heavier than the last. They passed the first few buildings, small wooden houses, their windows dark, the village eerily quiet. It seemed deserted, as if the cold had driven everyone inside, away from the biting wind and snow. "Come on," Eric whispered, leading her toward one of the houses. "We'll find shelter here." They reached the door of a small cabin, its windows frosted over, the wooden walls weathered by years of harsh winters. Eric knocked once, his hand shaking slightly from the cold. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Emma held her breath, praying that someone, anyone, would open the door and offer them refuge. But the cabin remained silent, as lifeless as the snow-covered landscape around them. "We'll have to break in," Eric said grimly, his eyes scanning the dark windows. "We can't stay out here." Emma nodded, too cold and exhausted to argue. They had no choice. As Eric reached for the door handle, a loud crash echoed through the trees behind them. Emma's heart leaped into her throat as she turned, her eyes wide with terror. The figure was back.
Eric's hand froze on the door handle as the crash reverberated through the village. Both he and Emma turned in unison, their breath caught in their chests as they strained to see through the swirling snow. The figure was out there, somewhere in the dark, moving closer. The wind carried the faintest echo of footsteps, deliberate and heavy, as if it wanted them to know it was coming.
Emma's pulse quickened, panic rising in her throat as her eyes darted around the quiet village. Everything felt wrong. The lights in the distance had promised safety, but now, standing in front of the lifeless cabin, the village seemed deserted, abandoned. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had walked into a trap, that the figure had been herding them here into this dead end. "We can't stay out here," Eric muttered, his voice tight with urgency. His grip on the door handle tightened, and with one swift motion, he forced it open. The wood creaked and groaned, but the door gave way, swinging inward to reveal the dark interior of the cabin. "Inside, now!" he urged, pulling Emma with him as they stumbled into the cold, empty room. Storm followed closely, his tail low and his ears alert, the dog sensing the danger that was closing in. Eric slammed the door shut behind them, bolting it with a rusted latch that barely seemed strong enough to hold. He turned and pressed his back against the door, his breathing ragged as he tried to gather his thoughts. The cabin was small, its walls lined with dusty shelves and worn furniture. A faint, musty smell clung to the air, as if no one had been inside for years. The only light came from the weak moonlight seeping through the frosted windows, casting eerie shadows across the room. Emma stood in the middle of the cabin, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to control her shivering. The cold outside had been brutal, but the fear was what truly chilled her to the bone. She could still hear the echo of the crash in her ears, could still feel the presence of the figure lurking just beyond the walls. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Eric didn't answer right away. He stood by the door listening, waiting for any sign that the figure had followed them to the cabin. His face was pale, his brow furrowed with concentration. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "We wait," he said quietly. "We wait and see if it tries to get in." Emma's heart sank at his words. She had hoped for a plan, for some way to escape this nightmare, but the truth was, they were trapped. There was nowhere to run. Storm let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the door as his body tensed. Emma's stomach twisted with dread. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to give up easily. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but beyond that, there was only silence. Emma found herself holding her breath, her ears straining to catch any sound that might betray the figure's movements. And then, there it was, a soft scrape against the door. Her heart stopped. Eric's eyes snapped to the door, his hand instinctively going to the handle as if he could hold it closed with sheer force. Storm let out another growl, deeper this time, his hackles raised. The scraping sound came again, slow and deliberate, as if the figure was testing the door, testing their defenses. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears. She took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. "Eric?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if it gets in?" Eric didn't respond. He was staring at the door, his jaw clenched, his body tense. The scraping stopped. For a moment there was nothing, just the wind and the silence. Then came a loud, deliberate knock. The sound was so sudden, so jarring that Emma jumped, a gasp escaping her lips. Eric flinched, his eyes narrowing as he pressed harder against the door. Another knock, louder this time. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Whoever or whatever was on the other side of that door wanted them to know it was there. It wasn't hiding anymore. The door creaked under the weight of the knock, the latch rattling slightly. Eric's hand shot up to hold it in place, his knuckles white with the strain. "Stay back," he said, his voice low and fierce. Emma nodded, taking another step away, her back pressing against the far wall. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could help them. But the cabin was nearly empty. There was no weapon, no means of defending themselves if the figure broke through. Another knock. This time the door shook under the impact, the wood groaning as if it could splinter at any moment. "Eric?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper, but the terror in it was unmistakable. Eric's face was set in grim determination. "We can't let it in," he said, his voice tight, "no matter what." The door shook again, harder this time, as if something heavy was leaning against it. Emma could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure wasn't going to stop. It was only a matter of time before it broke through. Then, just as suddenly as the knocking had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's ears rang with the absence of sound, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at Eric, who stood frozen by the door, his body still tense, waiting for the next move. But nothing came. No more knocks, no more scraping, just the wind outside whistling through the cracks in the cabin. Minutes passed, each one dragging on longer than the last. Emma didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, for fear of breaking the fragile silence. Finally, Eric spoke, his voice low and cautious. "Do you think it's gone?" Emma didn't know. She couldn't trust her instincts anymore. Everything about this night had been wrong, twisted. She wanted to believe it was over, that the figure had given up, but the fear still gripped her tightly, refusing to let go. "I don't know," she whispered. Storm, who had been silent for the past few minutes, let out a soft whine. He wasn't growling anymore, but his body was still tense, his eyes fixed on the door as if he too was waiting for something. Eric slowly stepped away from the door, his movements careful, deliberate. He listened, his ear close to the wood, but there was no sound. Whatever had been knocking was gone, or at least it wasn't making itself known anymore. "We'll stay here," Eric said, his voice firm. "At least until morning?" Emma nodded, though the idea of spending the night in the cabin, with the figure lurking somewhere outside, filled her with dread. But there was no other choice.
The hours crawled by as the night deepened, the air inside the cabin growing colder with every passing minute. Emma and Eric sat in the dim light, huddled together for warmth, their backs against the far wall, away from the door. Storm lay between them, his eyes closed but his body tense, always alert. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional gust of wind rattling the window panes, reminding them that the figure could still be out there, just beyond the thin walls. Emma couldn't shake the gnawing fear in her chest. Every creak of the wood, every groan of the wind made her flinch.
She kept expecting to hear the knocking again, to feel the weight of the figure pushing against the door, trying to force its way in. But the cabin remained quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world outside had come to a standstill. Her thoughts drifted back to the events that had led them here. The drive through the snowy mountains, the golden sunset that had seemed so peaceful, so beautiful. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? It felt like they had fallen into a nightmare, with no way to wake up. She glanced at Eric, who was staring out the frosted window, his face drawn and weary. He hadn't said much since the knocking had stopped, but Emma could see the tension in his body. The way his jaw was clenched and his fists balled up at his sides. "Do you think it's still out there?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper, her breath forming a faint cloud in the cold air. Eric didn't answer right away. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant. Finally, he shook his head, though he didn't sound convinced. "I don't know. It could be watching us, waiting." The thought sent a chill down Emma's spine, and she hugged her arms tighter around herself. She wanted to believe they were safe, that whatever had been hunting them had given up. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. The figure had followed them through the woods, through the tunnels, through the storm. It wasn't going to stop now. Not when they were so close. Suddenly, a faint noise caught her attention. A soft, almost imperceptible shuffling sound, like something moving outside. Emma stiffened, her heart skipping a beat as she strained to listen. Eric heard it too. His head snapped toward the door, his body going rigid. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Eric nodded, his eyes locked on the door. The sound came again, a low, dragging noise that sent a wave of fear crashing over her. It was closer now, as if something or someone was circling the cabin, slowly, deliberately. The air in the room seemed to thicken, every second stretching out unbearably. "Eric!" Emma's voice was barely a breath. "It's back." Eric's face hardened, and he stood slowly, careful not to make any noise. His hand went to the latch on the door, testing it, making sure it was still secure. The latch held, but the door creaked under the pressure, as if the weight of the figure outside was already bearing down on it. "We need to be ready," Eric said, his voice low and tense. "If it tries to get in again, we have to fight." Emma's stomach twisted with fear. Fight? With what? They had no weapons, no way to defend themselves if the figure broke through the door. She glanced around the room, her mind racing. There had to be something they could use, something to keep it at bay. Her eyes landed on a broken chair in the corner, its wooden legs splintered and jagged. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She moved quickly, grabbing one of the chair legs and handing it to Eric. "Here," she said, her voice shaking. "It's not much, but it's something." Eric took the makeshift weapon, his face grim. "Stay behind me," he said. "If it comes in, don't hesitate. We fight until the end." Emma nodded, though her hands were trembling. She picked up another chair leg, gripping it tightly, trying to steady her breathing. The noise outside had stopped again, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. The figure was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. For what felt like an eternity, they stood in the dark cabin, listening, waiting. The tension in the air was suffocating, the fear almost unbearable. Emma's mind raced with worst-case scenarios, images of the figure breaking down the door, its shadow looming over them as it crash. The door shook violently, the force of the impact reverberating through the cabin. Emma jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. The figure was trying to break in. Eric held his ground, pressing his weight against the door, trying to keep it shut, but the next blow was even harder, splintering the wood around the latch. "We can't let it in," Eric grunted, his muscles straining as he fought to keep the door closed. "Hold the other side!" Emma ran to the door, her heart pounding, and pressed her body against it, her hands shaking as she tried to brace the door with her own weight. The figure slammed against it again, the wood creaking and splintering under the pressure. It was only a matter of time before the door gave way. Storm barked furiously, standing between them and the door, his body tense, ready to protect them. But even Emma knew that if the figure got inside, there would be little the dog could do. Another crash, and the latch broke with a sharp snap. The door swung open, the cold wind rushing into the cabin like a breath of death. Emma's eyes widened in terror as she saw the shadowy figure standing in the doorway, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, fixed on them with an intensity that made Emma's blood run cold. "Emma, get back!" Eric shouted, raising the broken chair leg as he prepared to fight. But before she could move, the figure stepped into the cabin, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was savoring the moment.
The figure loomed in the doorway, its presence suffocating the air in the cabin. The dim light from the moon barely revealed its form, but Emma could feel the malevolence radiating from it, an oppressive force that pressed against her chest. Time seemed to slow as the figure stepped forward, its movements smooth, almost unnatural. Eric tightened his grip on the broken chair leg, his body tense and ready, but Emma could see the fear in his eyes. They were outmatched, and they both knew it.
"Stay behind me," Eric barked, his voice wavering slightly. Emma stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her back hit the cold wall of the cabin, and for a brief moment everything felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't wake from. But this was no dream. The terror was too real, the danger too immediate. Storm growled viciously, standing between them and the figure, his hackles raised. But even the dog sensed the hopelessness in the situation. The figure paused just inside the threshold, its eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, fixed on Emma. She felt her legs weaken, as if those eyes were draining the strength from her body. The air grew colder, almost unbearably so, and the oppressive weight of fear bore down on her like a crushing tide. Without warning, Eric lunged at the figure, swinging the broken chair leg with all his strength. The wood connected with a sickening thud, but the figure didn't flinch. It was as if Eric's strike had hit a solid wall of darkness. Emma gasped, her heart racing as Eric staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in shock. "No." The figure turned its gaze toward Eric, and in a single, fluid motion, it raised a hand. Before Eric could react, an invisible force slammed into him, sending him flying across the room. He crashed into the far wall with a sickening crack, his body crumpling to the ground. Emma screamed, rushing toward him, but Eric didn't move. His body lay still, lifeless, the chair leg rolling out of his hand. "No, no, no," Emma cried, tears streaming down her face as she dropped to her knees beside Eric, shaking him, pleading for him to wake up. But his eyes remained closed, his chest unmoving. The figure's cold presence loomed behind her, its shadow falling over them both. Emma could feel it, the end. It was here. The crushing weight of despair settled over her like a blanket of ice, freezing her in place. She couldn't fight, she couldn't run. There was nothing left. Storm barked furiously, charging at the figure, teeth bared. But the figure flicked its hand dismissively, and the dog was thrown aside like a rag doll, whimpering as he hit the ground. Emma's heart broke as she watched Storm struggle to stand, only to collapse in a heap. The cabin was silent now, save for the soft crackle of the wind outside. The figure stepped closer, its form towering over her as she knelt beside Eric's still body. Emma closed her eyes, bracing for the end, the darkness that was sure to follow. But then something stirred inside her, a warmth, a memory. She remembered the drive, the golden light of the setting sun over the mountains, the way Eric had smiled at her, full of hope and love. She remembered their laughter, the way the world had seemed so full of promise just hours ago, and she realized in that moment that she wasn't ready to let go. She wasn't ready to let the darkness take her. With a sudden surge of determination, Emma stood, her legs trembling but firm. She turned to face the figure, her heart pounding, her fists clenched. The fear was still there, gnawing at her insides, but something stronger had risen to the surface, a desperate will to survive. The figure paused, its glowing eyes narrowing as if surprised by her defiance. For the first time, Emma felt something shift in the air. The cold seemed to recede just a little, the weight of the figure's presence lifting ever so slightly. "I won't let you take me," Emma whispered, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You won't win." The figure hesitated, and in that hesitation, Emma felt an opening, a crack in the darkness. She didn't know how or why, but she knew she had to act. Without thinking, she reached down and grabbed the broken chair leg that Eric had dropped. Her hands shook as she raised it, holding it like a weapon, her eyes locked on the figure's glowing gaze. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The figure stood still, watching her as if it were weighing something, calculating its next move. Emma's breath came in slow, shallow bursts, her heart thundering in her chest. This was it, the final moment, the last stand. And then, with a guttural roar, the figure lunged at her. Emma swung the chair leg with every ounce of strength she had left, her body moving on pure instinct. The wood connected with the figure's chest, and for the first time it let out a sound, a low, inhuman hiss of pain. The darkness around it seemed to waver, its form flickering as if it were losing substance. Emma's eyes widened in shock. She had heard it. She had actually heard it. With renewed determination, she swung again, this time aiming for its head. The figure staggered back, its form shimmering and distorting, the darkness unraveling like threads in the wind. It let out another hiss, this one louder, more frantic, as if it was losing control. Emma didn't stop. She swung the chair leg over and over, each strike weakening the figure further until finally, with one last powerful blow, the figure shattered into a cloud of shadow and smoke. The dark mist swirled for a moment, twisting and writhing in the air, before dissipating into the cold night, leaving the cabin empty and still. Emma stood there, panting, her body trembling with exhaustion and shock. The chair leg fell from her hands, clattering to the floor. It was over. The figure was gone. She collapsed to her knees beside Eric, her hands shaking as she reached for him. "Eric, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, wake up." For a moment, there was nothing. But then, slowly, Eric stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked up at her, dazed but alive. "Emma?" His voice was weak, but it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Tears streamed down her face as she pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly. "You're okay," she whispered, her heart swelling with relief. "You're okay." Outside, the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the snow-covered landscape. The long night was finally over.